What aspects of your life revolve around sound? Sound is often forgotten, pushed to the side. With something like sound, we almost take it for granted and forget that our entire world revolves around sound. My name is Bailey Nelson, and for my senior capstone, I have decided to choose to talk about sound within addiction. So, sound determines many life outcomes based on how we choose to use sound, meaning we oftentimes think of us just having a conversation as us speaking with one another, but within our own conversations that we're having with those of us around, anywhere, that is us choosing to use sound in a particular way. So I think if we understand sound better, then we can better use it, and in the sense that we can change the way that we talk about certain topics and how we talk about people or how we talk to people, because I think we've all experienced a situation at least once in our lives where we wish that people would talk nicer or talk better, or and understanding really how sound impacts things in our lives that we don't normally think that they would impact. So my first finding when talking about sound is what is sound? So by definition, sound is vibrations that travel through the air or another medium that can be heard when they reach a person's or animal's ear. So there's really three main components to sound that I found and that I want to talk about today. Those three things are immersion, immediacy, and embodied. So first off, with immersion, and for the sake of this presentation, another aspect that I focused in within my research is on a particular podcast. So any examples that I give, I'm going to give to a podcast so it makes sense. So immersion in this sense, if we're thinking about a podcast, if I'm doing a podcast right here, for example, immersion is going to be that thing that sets me in the location. So for me, for example, behind me, I have a window. So let's say that window was open and we heard things like birds chirping, or I have a main road behind me. If I heard cars driving by and noisy traffic, that sets me in this location in my dining room. But say you were outside or at a park, the sounds that you would hear, the immersion that you would hear is possibly kids screaming and laughing. You could parents talking with one another, dogs barking if you bring your dogs to the park. These are all things that kind of play into the setting of immersion, along with immediacy. I think this is one that, especially as college students, we can all connect with. So immediacy is exactly what it sounds like. Sound is immediate. Once sound is out, it's out. You know what I mean? There's no replays, there's no do-backs. You can't take it back. So a lot of with immediacy, the things that we connect with, I like to think of it as say your favorite song or music that you like to listen to. Immediacy is almost how does it modulate time? Think tempo. We often think tempo in correlation to music, which is why I think anyone can relate to the immediacy aspect of it. And then embodiment. Embodiment is, I think it's interesting because embodiment is so large, and just every aspect of it is really fascinating. So for the sake of the podcast scenario, this would be the way the podcast sets the mood. So the music choice. Certain podcasts have different breaks in the music that they chose to use in order to create this setting or a mood, or I'm sure for a different example of movies, we've all seen a scary movie. You can kind of tell when something is about to happen based off of the music. Did it slow down? Did it speed up? Did it get all intense? And they use that music choice and that sound choice to make you feel a certain way. So embodiment is kind of a feeling. We often don't realize that at a very young age, we hear a sound and attach it to an emotion, and we go through life, and a certain sound may make us feel a certain way. For example, some coffee pots, they beep when they're done. And for those of us who like coffee, right? you hear the beep and you feel like a sense of enjoyment. Or for like sports fans, particularly like baseball, those of us who have played baseball, you go to hit a ball. If you hit the ball on the very end of the bat or like very close to your hands, it makes a certain sound and it hurts like extremely bad when you do this. So if you go to watch a baseball game and you hear that sound, you kind of like, you can almost feel yourself like cringe. So like embodiment is like, it's a feeling, and it's a feeling that you've associated with a sound from who knows when. It could be very small later in life. It happens at different stages, but just that feeling that you associate with a sound. So then moving on to finding number 2. So we're going to talk about addiction and why I've chosen to associate sound and addiction. Addiction is a huge problem within our country and around our world. It's just interesting how people choose to talk about addiction. So, for example, like I grew up in a house surrounded with addiction, and the things that people would tell me from a very young age is kind of how I learned to view addiction, even though like I lived in a house just full of it and kind of witnessing it firsthand and then hearing about it from other people. Addiction isn't like, it's not a great thing. But when you are told so many like bad things and like it puts into perspective how you're going to talk about it from the future based on what you hear. So that's kind of like my rationale for doing sound and addiction. However, going back to sound and like how you choose to understand sound, and then hopefully that is like your vision on how you're going to talk about something or talk about, a certain situation or a person or whatever. I think this goes hand in hand. So if you understand sound, then it could possibly change how you talk about addiction for the sake of this example. Because within addiction, it is a feeling, it's very overwhelming. We've all experienced hard things in life that you're kind of like, how am I going to get over this? And so I ask you to picture something extremely difficult that you've that you've had a hard time with, that you're trying to overcome. And for all of us, that's going to be different, right? It doesn't necessarily even have to be addiction. There's been things we've all gone through that you're like, how am I going to get through this? So I want you to picture that place, and I want you to think how much more difficult it would be if the world around you, everyone that you're surrounded by, all that pressure on top of it, and the negative views and the judgments and the people telling you you're not going to make it through it, you're not going to do this. Imagine how much more difficult it would have been for you to overcome that situation. So I think there's a heavy importance of why we should continue to like understand sound and learn how to use it more effectively, so it benefits not only yourself but everyone around us. And then lastly, to tie it all together, how I mentioned beforehand that we're going to be talking about a podcast. So this podcast that I specifically focused on is called The American Life. They have a specific episode that's based around addiction. And I chose this podcast because, well, it's a very popular podcast. Some of you may have heard it, some of you may not. But this episode on addiction is not like any other, because they talk about addiction not like how most people talk about addiction. It's very lighthearted and kind of like lighthearted in the sense that normally when we talk about addiction, it's very serious. It's very, like pull at the heartstrings. Like this isn't something to like joke about, laugh, nothing, right? And addiction is serious. But the American Life podcast, they take a different approach to it. So when I say lighthearted, it's a group of people, men and women, who share stories based around addiction. So their opening scene, for example, they're talking about a night that a lot of us either have experienced or I'm sure will experience one day. And that's that they set the scene of a bar that's really busy on like a weekend night. And they talk about how it's, I'm sure we've all been in a bar, if not, maybe we'll one day, where it's crowded, the music's loud, everyone's up at the bar, they want a drink, and there's only a few bartenders, right? So, they talk about these bartenders and how it's like a common theme for bartenders to do cocaine to get through the night. Now, many people don't know this except for the bartenders. Many people at the bar, they're just there for, the night. They don't realize this. So it's interesting, within the podcast, they share different stories like this. They also share another story of a person, a family member, who develops lung cancer. They've smoked all their life, they get lung cancer, and eventually the person passes away. But they talk about the difference between the bar situation and how people view the bartenders for doing cocaine to keep the energy levels up to make it through the night as addicts, right? And then on the other situation, the family member with the lung cancer, how never once did someone say, it's your fault, you did this to yourself, even though everyone knows this person smoked their entire life, they get lung cancer, even though they know they caused it, right? But it's how we differentiate the two. How do we get to choose who's the addict and who's not? Now, I just think it's interesting because, again, lightheartedly, they share stories that's very common experiences for everyone. And I think it creates an environment, not only where people feel comfortable to share stories like this and but so people feel comfortable. I think addiction, it is already talked about. And a lot of the times we say, that's the first step, is to talk about it, right? What's next? What are you going to do next? However, I don't think addiction is talked about in, I'm not going to say right, but the right way for the sake of this example. Because like I said, having that overwhelming feeling and pressure on you, yourself, and then society around you is going to add to that pressure. I think if we switched the way we talked about certain things, it would be beneficial for everyone. I think it'd be easier, not easier, it would help, but you know what I mean? If addicts are trying to recover, I think having a better dialogue and language and how you view people, because at the end of the day, people are people. Addicts are people going through life just like everyone else. So just, taking, understanding sound and using it better for the sake of this example. So that's why I chose the American Life podcast. I like that they open with an anecdote instead of a statistic, because people aren't numbers, people are people. However, I think one critique I would have made is I would have appreciated if the podcast used more sound towards the embodiment aspect of sound. If they would have kind of set the scene with people cheersing, glasses, or loud atmosphere music, what it sounds like when a place is loud, so you can kind of feel that setting, so you can really place yourself there. So understanding sound better will not only change the way that we understand it, but also how we choose to interact with others and how we choose to speak to people and speak about people. So you see, it sounds not that scary. It revolves around all aspects of our life, but if we understand it better, I think we'll go further in life as a society.